Hey everyone, I am Ms. Digital Editor Carmen Rios. I feel like you know me by now because I have been doing many of these today, but I'm back with another live Q&A from the National Sexual Assault Conference. I'm here with Elise Lopez.
Hi, so glad to be here.
Glad you could be here. And Elise is the director of, I'm totally just going to let you finish this.
It's crazy long. It's the assistant director of the relationship violence programs in the University of Arizona's College of Public Health.
Okay, and go ahead and tell me a little bit, because I feel like this is a good lead into talking about your study. Tell me a little bit about exactly what it is that you all do in that department.
So in the relationship violence program, we focus on research, evaluation, and technical assistance for sexual assault prevention and response. So we run the whole gamut of types of sexual assault, sexual misconduct on college campuses, also working on community-based issues. So we're working on campuses, communities, the whole spectrum of sexual assault, but we don't do prevention practice or services. So we do research and evaluation to help inform practice.
Awesome. And so you're bringing that research and academia really back into the bigger world. Awesome. We love doing that here at Ms. So that's perfect. And so you're presenting today, or you just presented?
Presenting this afternoon.
Okay, awesome. You're presenting today at the conference about the findings of a mapping study that you pioneered in Arizona. And I'm curious, can you sort of describe the study and maybe tell us the inception story and what led to, basically how did this mapping project come to be?
So there were a couple reasons that it came to be. One is that a couple years ago, there was a fabulous paper put out by some researchers at CDC that was about alcohol policies and sexual violence, and sort of starting to look at how might we change alcohol policies to reduce sexual violence. And one of the things they wrote about was that there might be a relationship between high densities of alcohol serving establishments, so lots of bars close together, and sexual violence police reports. So where you have lots of bars, you probably also have lots of police reports for violence. So we wanted to investigate that. The second reason we wanted to look into this was that Arizona has this huge statewide initiative called the Arizona Safer Bars Alliance. And that is a program where there are people and community agencies throughout the state that go out into bars and train bar staff to recognize and respond to sexual aggression. And so one of the things we had been thinking about with that initiative is, could there be some way to engage bar owners in wanting to do this training if we had some visual appeal to them about how prevalent sexual assaults and other types of violence are around bar areas. So we had lots of reasons, practically and research-wise, that we wanted to pull this off.
Awesome. And so then what did you actually do for the study? You mapped violence in relation to the distance from a liquor providing establishment, right?
Yeah, so what we did is we took the addresses of liquor licensees, so bars where people can actually drink on the premises, and mapped all of those and used different colors to shade where there are lots of bars close together. So you tend to see those bright red spots around college campuses, military bases, highways, stuff like that. And then over that, we mapped police data. So we took police data from 4 major cities in Arizona for all of 2016, and pretty much looked at their physical and sexual violence police reports. And what you end up seeing is, in places where you have these bright red spots, where there are lots of bars close together, you also tend to have clusters of police reports for physical and sexual violence overlaid right on top of them.
Oh, wow. So basically you're looking at the same map twice.
Yeah, right on top of each other.
Well, and so what do you think that what has this meant in Arizona? Has it done what you wanted it to do so far? Has it mobilized sort of has it helped that program and really driven interest in it?
So the paper actually was just published online recently. It's at mapaz-dashboard.arizona.edu. It's a white paper that's written in accessible language. It's out there for the public to view. And so that just came out. So we're just starting to translate that into practice. But what I'm hearing from folks who actually go out and recruit bars is they really do think that this is going to be a tool that is going to engage bar owners who might otherwise say, no, that doesn't really happen around here, or, oh, that happens, but it definitely doesn't happen near our establishment. So they really can see what's happening in their area. The other really great thing about the mapping project is that we were able to really look at how might we target our prevention efforts. One of the things that came out of this that we didn't really expect was a difference in where you have clusters of sexual and physical violence around college campuses. So what we found was that around campuses where you have students who are living on campus or in Greek housing, you tend to still see those clusters of police reports of violence around the campus where there are lots of bars. But where you have commuter campuses where people are coming for a class or two a day and then leaving, they have a ton of bars around them still, like in downtown areas, but you don't see the same clustering of police reports for violence. And so that kind of tells us that it might be super helpful to, for example, train bar staff who are in those high density areas around college campuses where students live. But if we want to do sexual assault prevention on commuter campuses, we might need to take kind of a different approach because they're not staying there and going to those bars. We don't know where folks from those campuses are going. We don't know where their assaults are happening. So it kind of comes back to, we really need to think about the characteristics of our student population and what's going on around our campuses, rather than just taking a blanket approach and saying, okay, we did a curriculum, therefore we're good.
Yeah, and in my last interview, I was talking to Holly from Everfi about situational prevention, and I'm just sort of now, I'm wondering, learning more about this study. What do you think this means for advocates in terms of what prevention programs actually look like what we're talking about and what the actual substance is? I think approaching topics like alcohol and sexual assault prevention is always dicey. You would never want to victim blame or at all justify sexual violence, but you also need to be realistic about the ways in which, that drinking might be rooted in a campus culture. So what sort of recommendations do you think you would have for navigating, maybe the flip side of the training for bar owners? Like, how does this impact how we need to be talking to students about drinking and, these spaces near their campuses and safety?
So that is definitely a huge issue that we're always up against. And I think there are a couple of important things. First of all, situational prevention really is the future of sexual violence prevention. We do a lot of work around knowledge building, at that individual level, working on people's relationships through bystander training. But we also should be looking at what are the environments and situations that can facilitate sexual aggression and violence. Because it's not only about people's personal knowledge, beliefs, and attitudes. It's also about what does our environment do to make it perhaps easier to perpetrate violent aggression, and what might we do to change that? So if we're looking at bar settings, one of the things we work on with bar staff is recognizing the difference between sexual aggression and flirting, first of all, but then also looking at what are the characteristics of their bar that might make it easier to facilitate sexual aggression. And how do we make it harder, right? So we're looking at their physical environment. We're looking at things like alcohol pricing. So for example, do they have things like 25-cent shots for ladies and no cover ladies nights all together, right? So things like that they may not have really thought about as sexual violence prevention, but that can have a huge effect on folks who might be perpetrating, right? So we look at that type of stuff. The other thing is when it comes to how do we talk about students, obviously we should be doing a lot more work around risk reduction with alcohol, whether we're talking about any type of injury prevention, right? Drunk driving prevention, violence prevention, etc. But we also can be talking about what are your drinking spaces like? What are the social norms that happen there? What pressures do you feel around sexual behavior or around conquest type of sexual behavior, especially for men? but also talking about, in drinking spaces, who can you go to for help? So we've done quite a few focus groups and surveys with undergraduate college students and with bar staff separately. And one of the interesting things that we found is that undergraduate women particularly tend to say, you know what, if somebody's being creepy toward me or I feel uncomfortable in a bar, I'm either going to leave or I'm going to tell my friends about it, or I might just go to the bathroom to try to distance myself from them. And they really want to talk to bar staff about it, but they feel like they're going to be blamed by bar staff, or it's not going to be a priority, or they're going to kind of say, well, that's your problem. You came here dressed that way.
Yeah.
But then when we talk to bar staff, they're very territorial about their patrons. I mean, bars are places where, like, this is people's industry. This is their thing. They want to keep their patrons safe. In many states, they're legally liable for patron safety. And so when we talk to bar staff, they're like, yeah, if somebody came up to me and said somebody was bothering them, of course I want to help. All they need to do is ask. So there's a disconnect there, right? Patrons don't want to ask for help, but bar staff say they want to help. So we also work on telling bar staff, hey, if you notice something, take initiative. The worst thing that can happen is somebody didn't need help. But we also tell patrons, hey, your bar staff are there to help. So with our programming, we're really looking at how do we get the message out to patrons of establishments that their bar staff are there to help. So we're working on a social media campaign right now. We also created bathroom stall flyers. That was one thing we heard from patrons was, you know what? If I'm trying to get away from somebody creepy and I go to the bathroom, that would be a fantastic place to see a message that I can go talk to the bar staff. Or, if I just had 5 beers and I'm going to be peeing for a long time, right? You think about like the practical measures of prevention. It's not always outside a bathroom stall.
It's not always glamorous, but it gets the job done.
It does.
Much like the bathroom in a bar. Yes.
Literally meet people where they are, right? Right? So,
Awesome. Well, yeah.
Connected.
Yeah, and I mean, it definitely, what are some things you think, are there any other sort of mapping studies that you think you'd like to do in the future? Like, I know that the workshop is about sort of how to implement a study like this, and I assume a lot of people are interested in the same exact thing, like where is the violence and where are the bars? But, do you think that there's sort of other overlapping factors that it would be interesting to map out in the same way?
Yeah, so we used police data for our study, and one of the main limitations with police data, well, 2 of them. One is underreporting, of course. Not everybody's going to make a police report, especially if it's sexual aggression that doesn't rise to the level of a crime. People just sort of write it off and move on, or blame themselves or whatever. The second part about that is that with police data, the pinpoints of where somebody reported a crime are not necessarily where the crime might have started. So if people are drinking at a bar and maybe there's no sexual aggression that's super obvious there, but maybe it's a situation that somebody could have caught early if they would have been looking at signs for it, they could have prevented those people from leaving together and a rape from happening, right? So a rape might be reported at a residence, but really our prevention efforts are not going to take place in a residence. We could have intervened a lot earlier. So we have this spatial complication in that way. And so I think it would be really interesting, especially for campus sexual assault or really targeted community efforts, to be able to get self-reports from folks. Especially on or around college campuses. Are there ways to work with students to do some mapping of where they feel are dangerous or unsafe spaces? It might be certain areas around campus, certain party houses, lots of different places where they might feel unsafe or they've experienced aggressive behavior, but maybe they're not reporting it to campus authorities or police.
Yeah. And I'm going to go off topic and rewind, but you said that part of your training is the difference between sexual aggression and flirting. And when I was talking to Tarana Burke before, she was saying how, Me Too has become a verb and people are like, oh, I got Me Too'd, like someone tattled, I got Me Too'd. And I know it's I feel like it was like a Kanye lyric. It's everywhere. This idea, obviously, this would happen now where perpetrators are like, no, but now I'm the victim because you called me out. And now men are like, I don't want to mentor women. I don't want to hire women because it's obviously too dicey because you just can't speak to a woman and it's suddenly sexual harassment. So just for the folks in the world, what is the difference between sexual aggression and flirting that you tell these folks working in bars? Like, what are the telltale signs that you're telling them to look for?
So we're really looking at what's happening on the receiving end, first and foremost, right? Somebody on the receiving end may not be saying, oh my gosh, you're a creep, get away from me. But what is their body language saying? Do they have open body language? Are they smiling about it? Is it a genuine smile? Where are their feet pointing? What's their proximity to the person? So we really look at those small body language cues, because we also can't hear people in a bar, right? So bar staff may not be able to hear what's going on, but you can always see what's going on with body language. And we're looking at strings of cues, right? Because one tiny cue, unless it's really big, sort of those obvious situations, you may not know what's going on in that situation, but what's happening over time. For example, somebody who looks nervous when you first glance at them and they're with another person, perhaps they're nervous because this person is creeping them out and they feel unsafe. Perhaps they're nervous because that other person is super hot and they're nervous about, am I going to say the right thing? Yeah. What am I going to do? So we watch that over time and look at what's happening on that receiving end. That is the first place we tell people to start. And we also really try to get out of this idea that you should only be looking for the person in the bar who looks like an obvious creeper. The person who's being quiet and slick and touching everybody, grabbing people around the waist, getting somebody obviously intoxicated. Yeah, those things absolutely happen. But what we also see happening is there has been a lot of normalization for many, many years of sexual harassment behavior that has always been wrong. It's always felt wrong to people on the receiving end, but we're having this social discourse about it now that's really not about saying your behavior is now called this. It's always been this. But now we can talk about it more openly and have this conversation. So we're really looking at how do you unlearn this idea that sexual aggression is normal or wanted in a bar environment.
Yeah.
We're also talking to them about trajectories of perpetration behavior. So a lot of the thinking on sexual violence prevention for a long time focused on the idea of serial perpetrators, and that most rape was perpetrated by serial perpetrators, especially in the college age group. And what newer science has found using more advanced modeling techniques and looking at people over time and their behavior over time is that you have a lot of trajectories of perpetration behavior. You do have a really small minority of folks who perpetrate over and over again. But you also have other trajectories of folks who maybe perpetrate at one time point or at a small time point in their lives and then for some reason stop. You have people who never perpetrate in high school, then suddenly they get to college and level off. So you have lots of different things that are happening. So it's also about retraining of perpetration doesn't always look like a stranger popping out of the bushes. And more often it's going to be an acquaintance, and it's not necessarily going to be this big obvious event. So how do we retrain ourselves to look for earlier signs, be more open to the fact that anybody could perpetrate, especially if they're drinking, and then also looking at how do we get ourselves out of the mindset that this is always about calling the police. Because, especially for some bar staff, it's very much I'm not going to intervene in that situation because technically they're not doing anything wrong. It's not a crime, in other words. We don't need to call police for that. So one of the things I like to say to bar staff is, we're not here to teach you to call the police better. We're teaching you how to recognize signs, intervene early, sometimes in ways where people don't even realize they're being intervened upon, so that you don't have to call law enforcement later. Right?
Yeah. Awesome. And you touched on this idea that these things have been happening for a long time, and we're finally starting to acknowledge that we need to unlearn them. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Mary Koss, your mentor and your colleague. And when you emailed me, you were really excited to talk to me about Mary, who pioneered the first ever national study on rape prevalence in the 80s with the help of Ms. and Gloria Steinem. And an update to that work is forthcoming. And I mean, it's obvious how your work overlaps with Mary's work. You're both working with numbers and mapping out data on violence. But how did that study sort of shape your own work? Like, I'm interested in the legacy of feminism that was built out of that 1980 study. That how has the field changed since then? And you know, I mean, how have the numbers changed since then, and the methodologies, and just sort of the nooks and crannies of it all?
So Mary Koss did the first national study on rape prevalence among college women, and that study was published in 1987 and really was the first study that found the 1 in 4 number, so that 1 in 4 women experience rape or attempted rape during their lifetime. And that number has stagnated over time. It has not really changed. And I think one of the ways that that study was really pivotal for this field, I mean, it really started this field. And it was written off as rape hype or feminazi propaganda. And
I'm sorry, rape hype.
Rape hype, yeah. So essentially women calling bad sex rape. But what I think it really changed for the field was that was the first study where behaviorally specific items were used to measure unwanted sexual experiences. So, for example, if you ask a group of women, have you ever been raped? You will typically get a much smaller number than if you ask that same group of women, have any of these things happened to you, and list out behaviors that legally constitute rape. Because so many women don't necessarily identify what happened to them as legally meeting the criteria for rape. And even worse, when you go down the line to the other areas of sexual assault. And so that really changed our understanding of how you measure rape. It really became the gold standard way to look at victimization. I think that how that has influenced a lot of newer science is not only in using behaviorally specific measures, but also evolving to look at gender neutral wording for victimization and perpetration, so that these days we're able to use those same instruments reworded to look at the spectrum of folks who might be victimized or perpetrating. I think that one of the next places we would really like to go with that, or that I would like to see the field move, is getting more into the details of how much sexual assault is happening per incident, right? So a lot of times when we're measuring sexual violence these days, we might measure a bunch of things that somebody did, let's say in a perpetration in the last 12 months. But we don't necessarily know, did this person do 5 different things separately as separate incidents in the last year, or did they do 5 different things in one incident to one person? So, and that might have a huge bearing on how we deal with perpetration prevention. So I really think that we're getting to a place in this field on the science end where we can start to ask those really nuanced questions and find ways to answer them as well. And then from there, be able to do things like targeted prevention to different areas or groups of people, or take approaches we might not have considered before.
Yeah, and the work that you do is really unique, I would say, even at a convening like this of advocates and activists and people who work in the field of sexual violence prevention. How did you come to be sort of working in the numbers game and in the violence prevention game at the same time?
I used to work in community-based settings, actually in substance abuse treatment and prevention with adolescents. So I did adolescent health for a really long time and just sort of ended up in the research side as a trajectory from what I was doing in community-based settings. And so I really got into health science working in adolescent health. And one of the major projects I worked on that got me into the violence field was working with girls with trauma. So we had a federal grant at one point that was for treating substance abuse treatment for adolescent girls who'd experienced other forms of trauma. And I worked with so many amazing young women who were just in this revolving door of the juvenile justice system and substance abuse treatment. And many of them had experienced some kind of violence, child abuse, sexual violence, were currently in violent, intimate relationships. And for many of them, that trauma had never been believed or had been minimized, or if it had been addressed, it was insufficient in many ways. And that really had a huge impact on me to see how much this issue was flying under the radar still today. And I, at that point in my career, went back for a master's degree and a doctorate and started delving more into trauma studies and violence. And having a background originally working in community-based agencies, I think I was able to bring that perspective of, okay, how do you do science that doesn't just sit in a journal where nobody's going to read it, but that will actually translate into practice in ways that are usable and practical, because that doesn't always happen, right, with a lot of studies. So I start at the very beginning when I'm asking research questions to think about, what will we say about this later? Not just, this is interesting scientifically, but how will somebody use this in the future? And I think that that's a very important place to be with this kind of science.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, that's amazing. And my last question is the question I've been asking everyone. So it's also closely related, but it's going to take a lot of bold moves to accomplish the vision of this conference to end sexual violence in one generation. And so what's your bold move? What's next? What are you going to be taking home from here and running with when you get back to campus?
I've been really excited at how many people at this conference are starting to look at policy and environmental level change. So we're really moving beyond the individual approach and starting to talk about how do we change social norms within service agencies and the way we work with people who are coming to us for prevention or services. How do we change environments that facilitate perpetration? How do we build connections with city planners and get into environmental design to prevent violence? And so I've been extremely energized by that so far. And one of the things that I would like to take from here is being able to pick that work up and run with it on the science side. So how can I continue to conduct studies that have those very specific aims to work at those outer levels of our social ecology, so that I can then turn that back around for people on the ground who are doing this work out there every day. So it's quite invigorating.
Awesome. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. And yeah, thank you for being here and for all the work you're doing. And I definitely look forward to learning more from your research in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to meet you.